these ignorant demonstrators. Who are they demonstrating for? For these murderers, these rapists, these mass killers. This is a reflection of a deep rot that has pervaded the intellectual hub of free societies. And this vilification of Israel, the Jewish people, and Western values has been propagated by a systemic alliance between the ultra-progressive left and radical Islam. It must be resolutely fought by civilized societies to safeguard their future. This is why we must all commend President Trump's decisive actions against anti-Semitism, and we must pressure other governments to do the same.
Standard fare. I mean, I do think he's correct when he talks about the deep rot in Western society, but the deep rot is reflected in the fact that we are supporting a genocide. We are supporting an apartheid state that is executing a genocide. Gets back to the question you raised before about why no one in the West is saying anything about the murder of these rescue workers in Gaza last week. The answer is there is a deep rot here. There is a moral rot, and that moral rot is inextricably bound up with our relationship with Israel.
Government can do in 2 months more than any organization can do in its lifetime. And so when we talk about the importance of a bipartisan fight against anti-Semitism, which of course I endorse, and I, as my predecessor said, I condemn anti-Semitism on the right and on the left. I'm an equal opportunity condemner of anti-Semitism.
You're alluding to Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson.
Yeah, none of them are any good on the right. On the left, I don't like any of these anti-Semites, and I'm not shy about it. But the government, the United States government or the government of France or the government of any other country has the power to rein in anti-Semitism in a much more effective way. And you know, people say, well, you know, the governments are not in the business of changing the way people think. That's true, but, you know, to my thinking, most people who are, you know, anti-Semites, most of these people running around, we're not going to win their hearts and minds because they don't have hearts and they don't have minds. So, you know, how are we going to, there's no reason to think we're ever going to convince them, but we can deport them, we can put them in jail, we can make their lives miserable, we can cut off their funding, and that's what the Trump administration is doing for the first time.
The point that we have reached in our society is one where anybody who protests against the genocide in Gaza is identified as an anti-Semite. You want to think about that. This is really ludicrous. I hate to use hot language like this because I've been sort of training myself over the years to stay away from hot language because it's not very effective in forums like this. But this is ludicrous, right? People who are out legitimately protesting a genocide, exercising their freedom of speech, are turned into anti-Semites. They're deported. They're put in prisons in Louisiana. They're taken off the street by groups that look like the Gestapo at work. You just sort of wonder what is going on here. Have we lost our mind? First of all, you want to remember that this is all part and parcel of the pivot away from Europe. Hegseth has been the point person on this whole issue, saying that we are going to greatly reduce our presence in Europe and we're going to focus on East Asia. And this is just another manifestation of that policy at work. So this has all sorts of bearing for what's going on with regard to Ukraine. Second point I would make is the fact is, given Trump's behavior, people in East Asia, especially in countries like Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, are really beginning to wonder whether they can depend on the United States, whether the United States has their back. And the scenario that most people worry about the most is China attacking Taiwan. So the reason that the defense guidance, which was released about a week and a half ago, was leaked about a week and a half ago, focuses not only on East Asia, but in particular focuses on Taiwan, is I think the United States is interested in shoring up its deterrence vis-a-vis Taiwan. We don't want to send a message to the Chinese that we will not defend Taiwan and therefore give them a possible thought that they could invade Taiwan and get away with it. So I think that's what's going on. He's just trying to firm up deterrence vis-a-vis the Taiwan scenario. Just a quick point. It's very important to understand that the Chinese have been behaving in provocative ways towards Taiwan long before Hegseth made those comments, right? The Chinese are determined to put enormous pressure on Taiwan to bring Taiwan to its knees so that it can reincorporate Taiwan into China. That's what's going on here. And Hegseth is responding to that. That's not to say that the Chinese have not responded to Hegseth. This is exactly what you got, what you would expect to get. You're going up the escalation ladder. And this is very dangerous. I don't deny that for 1 second. Now, your question is, do we think we could win a war against the Chinese? I think the answer is probably no. But the question you really want to ask yourself is, do you think the Chinese think they can win a war against us? The answer is probably no. And what Hegseth is doing here is trying to make sure that that's what the Chinese think, because that's the best way to produce deterrence in this very dangerous situation.
Takeaway. This combined examines two critical geopolitical and domestic issues. First, it explores the erosion of free speech in the U.S. under the Trump administration, which Mearsheimer and Napolitano argue targets critics of Israel by labeling them anti-Semites, potentially jailing or deporting them, and attacking universities. Daniel McAdams warns this sets a dangerous precedent for future administrations. Second, it addresses U.S. Secretary of Defense Hegseth's pledge to defend Taiwan against China, which Mearsheimer frames as a deterrence move within Trump's pivot from Europe to Asia. He warns of escalation risks amid China's provocations, suggesting neither side believes it can win a war, yet the U.S. aims to reassure jittery allies like Japan and South Korea. Analysis. Mearsheimer and Napolitano critiquing a Trump-aligned former U.S. ambassador to Israel who advocates extreme measures, deportation, imprisonment, against those labeled anti-Semites, broadly defined to include Gaza genocide protesters. Mearsheimer calls this ludicrous, highlighting the absurdity of equating protest with hate, while Napolitano notes the ambassador's potential UN role as Beltway gossip. Trump's targeting of universities, Columbia, Harvard, Princeton, Penn, is seen as an expanding campaign, with Mearsheimer predicting broader reach, e.g., Chicago, Stanford, aiming to wreck them. McAdams' clip warns this First Amendment siege could rebound under a left-wing president, targeting conservatives, a point Napolitano ties to the Pentagon Papers case, hinting at personal risk. Transitioning to Taiwan, Mearsheimer frames Hegseth's Japan boast as part of Trump's Europe to Asia shift, responding to China's long-standing pressure on Taiwan. Leaked defense guidance prioritizes Taiwan deterrence, especially as allies question U.S. reliability post-Trump. China's naval response escalates tensions, but Mearsheimer doubts either side expects victory in a distant war, emphasizing deterrence hinges on Chinese perceptions. The analysis links domestic repression to global posturing, revealing a U.S. struggling with credibility and coherence. Summary. Mearsheimer critiques Trump's crackdown on free speech, targeting Israel critics as anti-Semites and universities, with McAdams warning of future blowback. It then shifts to Hegseth's Taiwan defense pledge, a deterrence move amid Trump's Asia focus and China's provocations, highlighting escalation risks and U.S. efforts to reassure allies despite mutual doubts of winning a war. Conclusion. Mearsheimer concludes that the U.S. is juggling a repressive domestic shift, stifling dissent under a guise of combating anti-Semitism, with a risky foreign policy gambit in Taiwan. This dual trajectory threatens civil liberties at home and stability abroad, reflecting a nation overextended and misaligned in its priorities.